It is argued that the Lisbon Treaty will abolish both British democracy and the British Constitution that have been in existence for hundreds of years. The beginning of modern national democratic parliaments can be traced back to Great Britain itself. The Charter of Liberties of Henry I was written in 1100 and was the forerunner to the Magna Carta, which means Great Charter. The Magna Carta of 1215, which is part of the uncodified constitution, received the seal of King John, which put in writing the rights of habeas corpus and trial by jury. He did this under pressure from the English barons. King John annulled the document under orders from Pope Innocent III. At this time, both England and Ireland were papal territories, for which the king was paid 1,000 marks per year. The breaking of the Magna Carta gave rise to the First Barons' War. A year after it started, King John died from dysentery and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, King Henry III, and the Magna Carta was reissued in his name. In 1264, King Henry III and his son, Prince Edward, were defeated and captured by Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester, at the Battle of Lewes. De Montfort created the first English Parliament without royal approval. Archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls and barons were summoned, as were 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from each borough. This was the first time boroughs were represented, and these were selected through democratic means, making it the first type of elected parliament. They met in January 1265. In 1295, the Model Parliament was assembled by Henry's son, King Edward I. This was considered the first representative assembly. The parliament included aristocracy, clergy, 2 knights from each county were present, 2 burgesses from each borough, and 2 citizens from each city. In 1341, under King Edward, Parliament was split, as it was summoned separately for the first time, as the upper chamber, which was made from nobility and the clergy, would later become the House of Lords. The lower chamber, made from knights and burgesses, would later become the House of Commons. This created the bicameral mechanism that is still used today. The power of Parliament grew, as some legislator now needed approval from both houses before it became law. The power of Parliament grew again in 1407, as the Commons now had power over taxation. During the reign of King Henry VIII, Wales was politically joined onto England through the Wales Act of 1535 and 42. This led to Welsh representation in Parliament, and in 1544 the term House of Lords was first used. In 1628 the Petition of Right was issued to Charles I from Parliament, in regards to abuses by the King over freedoms and rights issued in the Magna Carta. For example, habeas corpus was not being respected by the King. Charles I was a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He also issued taxes without the approval of Parliament. Other circumstances led to growing friction between the King and Parliament, most notably his choice of bride and the King's interference in the Church of England. There were also religious quarrels in Scotland over the introduction of the Book of Common Prayer into the Scottish Church. The Presbyterians saw this as an attempt to force Anglicanism on the Reformed Church. As a result, they expelled the Episcopalian government of the bishops and replaced them with a Presbyterian government, which led to the First Bishops' War of 1639. An embarrassing defeat for Charles followed, and was repeated again with the Second Bishops' War of 1640. Charles was forced to recall Parliament after being forced to pay the cost of the Scottish army. He then recalled Parliament to ask to levy taxes to repay his losses. This was seized upon by Parliament, who managed to engineer more powers. After the 1641 Assent Act, Parliament had to be called at least once every 3 years, and Parliament could now only be dissolved with its own consent. They also negotiated the execution of William Laud. In 1642, Charles entered the House of Commons accompanied by 400 soldiers with the intention of arresting 5 members of Parliament for treason. This was a momentous point in the history of Parliament, as the Speaker of the House refused to answer the King and instead pledged allegiance to Parliament. Civil war ensued between royalty and Parliament, which resulted in 3 main wars in England. Charles was defeated and was put on trial for high treason for attempting to raise a foreign army to fight against English citizens. He was found guilty and beheaded, and the War of the Three Nations eventually ended after horrific battles in England, Scotland and Ireland, as Charles I's son, Charles II, was defeated in Scotland and fled to France after being defeated by Oliver Cromwell in 1651. He went on to rule England via a military dictatorship as Lord Protector until his death in 1658. The restoration of the monarchy followed when Charles II was invited back from his exile in France to take the crown in 1600. Under Charles II, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679 passed, as Parliament used this document to define, strengthen and protect the rights of people being unlawfully detained and prosecuted without evidence and due process. Although later amended, it is part of the unwritten British Constitution. Habeas corpus is a writ that requires a person who is detained by authorities to be brought before a court of law to determine if they have been unlawfully detained. Charles II died in 1686, and his brother James II ascended to the throne. James faced battles on 2 fronts, as both religious and political quarrels made him unpopular. He promoted Catholics to positions of power at the expense of Protestants, which was unpopular in Protestant England, and the king's divine right to rule, as in the past, was met by Parliament's struggle for dominance.